Welcome to 10 Minute Tuesday. If you are new here, my name is CrysDawna. I am a furniture artist. Every Tuesday we go over some cool things in the business. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we go over practical stuff. So last week I talked about sandpaper for 10 minutes and I didn't think I could, but we're back for part 2 and we're going to talk about sandpaper for another 10 minutes. But this time I am actually going to take the sandpaper and put it to the surface and show you how I use the sandpaper, what grit do I use for each things, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. I thought that might be a little bit more helpful than going over the grits. I think some people have this piece of can't stay there, pair. So some people already understand the different grits and what they mean. And so I'm actually going to give you a practical demonstration of using different grits. So I only pulled out a few because we already talked about this. Is this piece of hair falling up? What is happening? Ah! Okay, whatever. Anyways, so I have 5 different grits, I think. I wanted to keep it kind of simple. That still seems like a lot. But I had talked to you guys last week about how they have less than 80 grit. So I pulled out a 60 grit, and this is where you can see it. I am going to play around with my Bosch orbital sander today so that I can show you what you need to use with your sanders. I also am going to show you kind of a pet peeve of mine when it comes to distressing. I did this in the beginning, that's why I can talk about this, and I can tell you not to do this because it's not natural. So 60 grit, we have our 80 grit sandpaper, boom, 80 grit. I brought out the 120 grit, the 220 grit, and the 320 grit. I will tell you that last week I talked about how 80, 120, and 220 were the top 3, but I didn't tell you 320 and 60 were. I use those as well. So these are the ones that I use the most. We're going to play around with my orbital sander. So just know that if you're doing this by hand, same thing applies. Just know that an orbital sander may be a little bit faster. And usually I use my surf prep, but I know that not everybody can afford a surf prep. So I'm going to show you on my Bosch. I switched over to surf prep because I have burned through so many sanders like this. Honestly, these are a dime a dozen when it comes to me because I burn through at least 2 a year. But if you are first starting and you want an orbital sander, I suggest you get a Bosch or a DeWalt if you can't afford the surf prep right away. But we are going to go over what I use for a painted surface and what I use for a wood surface. So let's get started. The first grit I'm going to use is a 60 grit. This is what I use to strip surfaces, whether it is a factory finish with wood or paint. I do not use this to smooth things out because it's going to be rough, and I don't use this to distress. This is just for stripping, and you'll see right here how it strips off that factory finish, and then I'm going to show you how it strips off the paint as well. Next, I'm going to move up to the 80 grit. So let's say that I stripped a surface with my 60 grit first. I would slowly move my way up to get the most smooth finish. So then I would do 60, 80, 120, 220, so on and so forth. But you don't have to start with 60. 80 is good enough that you can strip the surfaces off of factory finishes and paint with that. And I show you here how you can strip with that as well. So I don't smooth out with my 80 and I don't distress with my 80. I just use that to strictly strip surfaces of paint or of a factory finish. Next, I'm going to move up to my 120 grit. Now, if you have a factory finish that is failing super hard, this is going to strip it off. So it's a lot smoother than your 80 grit, but I like to distress with 120 grit. And you see here, I distress the sides and the corners. When I distress, I only distress areas that are going to be naturally distressed. You can use it to smooth your paint, but you're going to see right here with an orbital sander, it's going to strip your paint off. Okay, so generally what I do is I use this to smooth my surface when I'm doing a factory finish. I use it to distress. And then also you can distress with the 120 if you don't have a really good factory finish. This is going to take me forever to strip that factory finish. So that's why you start lower and work your way up. But you see how I'm going over that 60 and 80 part? You're going to want to do that, and that's going to smooth your surface so that it's not super rough. So if you do strip your piece, make sure you go over it with a 120 or 220 to smooth it out. Next, I'm going to show you the 220 grit. This is generally too high of a grit to strip any kind of surface off, and I'm going to show you this. But when I'm using my 220 to smooth my paint, I like to do it by hand because your orbital sander is moving so fast that it can distress your paint when you have a 220, even though that grit is higher. So you got to really be careful of what you're using your orbital sander for because it moves so fast. But you see right here, it's not going to strip that factory finish off. So now I'm going to use my 220. I'm going to just fold it in half and do it by hand. And that's generally what I do when I smooth my surface. I don't generally use the orbital sander. I use a block or something like that. But I'm just showing you this for the purpose of showing you the different sandpapers. This is a 220. And so I go over the surface. You can distress the corners with this because you can moderate your pressure. But 220 will smooth your paint out. If you press hard enough, it will distress your paint too. You can see right there. So it really depends on what you want to do, but this will be for smoothing, sometimes for distressing. It's not going to be for stripping. Then you're going to move up to 320 if you ever use 320, and that is going to be for smoothing. Depending on your paint, usually chalk style paints. Usually with a chalk style paint, you can distress it with a 320 if you want. You can also use the 220 and 320 to sand in between top coats. So that's also an option. I use those two for a smoother finish. You could use the 320 to just do a final sand over to smooth your finish. But next, I want to show you something that I did in the beginning of my business. This is not natural. So when I'm distressing, I do it naturally. This is not natural. Don't do it. It doesn't look natural, and I cringe when I look at my stuff back in the day. So just when you're distressing, do it on the corners or places where there's going to be natural wear and tear, because nobody likes it to look like there's cups sitting on their furniture. Okay, everybody, I hope you enjoyed that 10-minute Tuesday. It was a little bit less than 10 minutes, but hopefully you got a little bit better understanding of sandpaper, how I use sandpaper, what grit I use when, and don't distress your pieces like I just showed you. I did that in the beginning. That's not natural. Don't do it. All right, guys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.